So hello and welcome to today's session. This presentation will provide a guide and a reference point as we progress through the content, and it can be found in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We encourage questions, so please use the question box to share any you have. And if you haven't already done so, please let us know that you can hear us okay by using the question box, which you'll find in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm Helen Scanlon and I'm part of the provider development team. My background is varied. I have a vocational teaching background. I'm a literacy and numeracy specialist and I have a teaching and assessing experience from a range of settings, including schools, colleges and private training organisations, teaching from below entry level to master's level. I've got a master's degree in education and professional development and I've worked for a number of years in a quality improvement role. Have been a curriculum leader and lecturer in teacher training, and I also got experience of being part of formal quality assurance activities and Ofsted inspections. I've been working with our education and childcare T-level since May 2020, and I'll share the learning that this has brought throughout today's webinar. So you can see the objectives for today's session on the screen now. This session will last between 60 and 90 minutes and it is being recorded to allow all relevant colleagues to access it. We're also joined today by Janet King, the Sector Manager for Education and Childcare. Hello Janet, and thanks for joining us today.
Hello Helen, hello everyone. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Thanks Janet. Okay, we're going to start today with a quick recap of the theory related to best practice in relation to teaching, learning and assessment. So this first bullet point explains best practice in curriculum planning, looking at the bigger picture and developing students' wider skills and competencies, rather than focus on teaching and learning on knowledge and development of that alone. That the wider development of each student is also vital to consider. The second follows on from this, a more recent Ofsted report commenting on having a holistic approach to development and a recommendation for centres not to focus on the students simply passing a test. And the final quote here is from the DfE T-level website, telling students what they should expect from their T-level programme. The completion of the programme will allow them to progress onto skilled employment or onto a higher level apprenticeship, and not only onto higher education. The reference to skilled employment is one important difference between T and A-level outcomes. The wider abilities and competencies which would be needed for skilled employment need to be developed as part of the T-level programme. It's not only about the knowledge and understanding of the subject area, it's also about applying and using it effectively and confidently as a professional in the industry. So this slide includes some useful quotes to keep in mind in relation to assessment. If we focus on the learning rather than the exam performance, the students should be more confident in their knowledge and understanding and be able to apply the knowledge to the exams and ESP. This approach will be vital if we are to prepare the students for employment when they complete their T-level programme. And then it's also been proven that this approach creates more autonomous learners, able to problem solve and have a broader knowledge base to use in the relevant industry. As we progress through this webinar today, please keep these points in mind. Okay, we're going to start today with a poll. Please choose the most relevant answer to the question shown on the screen now. What is the biggest challenge do you feel for teachers in relation to preparing students in education and childcare for the T-level exams? If your preferred answer differs to the choices provided, please choose the closest one, but use the question box to add any different or a more appropriate answer for yourself. This will help us to personalise today's session as much as we can. So I'm going to launch the first poll now. So I just ask that you choose the most relevant answer from the choices on the screen, please. I'll just leave that open for a couple more seconds. Thank you to those who've already voted. Okay, thank you. I'm going to close the poll now. And the most prevalent answer there was the answer of number 3, supporting students to read the exam questions properly and carefully. But we do have a mixture across the board, so thank you for your input so far. So as I say, we will be using these answers as the basis of today's session, exploring the strategies for exams that could be used for each of those issues. Okay, moving on, we've got some questions for your consideration to help you to review your students' learning and support needs in relation to assessment of T-levels. So the question is, how aware are your students of their weaknesses and development areas? I know it's early days, the courses have just started, but all of these can be built into your planning and delivery of your teaching and learning activities. So breaking that down, then the first of all is subject-specific knowledge and skills. Are there any areas in particular that your students are weaker and stronger in? Are they keeping a record of the knowledge and understanding they're developing whilst they're on the course? The next point is English, because exam reading and writing skills and competencies are different skills to everyday reading and writing. If they have limited exam experience, is there a plan for them to be developed and practiced whilst on the programme? Dealing with and overcoming any exam nerves, and although some nerves are helpful to bring out our best performance, students need to know how to deal with this and manage them effectively, especially if their exam experience is limited. For time management, this is both for revision activities during the actual exams. And finally, the revision strategies. Which do they know of? And do they know how to use them effectively? Has the curriculum been planned with this in mind? Janet, I'm just going to quickly bring you in to see if there's anything else which is subject specific or that I've missed there, please.
I don't think you've missed anything, Helen. I think one thing, just building on what you've said there, is that possibility to bring in that the sort of skills associated with metacognition. So thinking about self-reflection, thinking about sort of, peer feedback and working together and really taking seriously, the students taking their own learning very seriously. I know you talked about independent study, autonomous study and things like that. I think, learning from each other will also help those students to sort of take a step back and reflect. What do other people, what can they tell me about my own learning and what I'm doing well in? Because we're notoriously not very good at pointing out things we do well. We're notoriously good at pointing out things that we're not so good at or that we don't think we're so good at. So I think allowing for those reflective strategies, including self-reflection, and peer collaboration would be a really useful tool here as well. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, completely agree with that. And also, all of these areas are not simply for the teacher to develop. Peer learning and peer support is also going to be vital here during the programme. So thanks for highlighting the self-reflection and awareness. Brilliant. Okay, we're going to explore all the summative assessment activities for the Education and Childcare T-level, starting with the core exam component. But this next slide contains important dates and content, as well as the link to qualhub, the page for this is where you would find the up-to-date information regarding student support related to the exams. If centres have planned to have all the core content delivered by Easter, they could choose the summer series for the first exam entry. This would be booked at the point of registration. So the dates for the 2 exams on the summer series are currently shown on this slide, and which elements are covered in each exam. For the Employer Set project, the window is in May. Pre-release material should be shared 3 weeks before the first supervised assessment session. We've also included the table showing how the core and occupational specialisms assessment are aggregated for the overall TQ grade. An example of this would be the student getting a B grade for the core component and a merit grade for the occupational specialism. These would be aggregated to give an overall merit for the technical qualification, and you'll find that table in the qualification specification. Okay, so the exams are designed to allow the students to put the theoretical knowledge they have gained into practice and also show the depth of their knowledge and understanding. Students should be encouraged to break down the exam questions, identifying what they are being asked to do with their knowledge and how to apply it to given scenarios. They should also focus on applying the core knowledge and analysing why they are making the professional, skilled decisions they are by being reflective and evaluative, bringing in again what Janet was saying in the last slide about metacognition. But we'll have a look at what that means in practice. So each exam must align to 3 assessment objectives, and these are shown on the table now. To summarise these, assessment objective 1, questions relate to knowledge recall and the how. Assessment objective 2 builds on from assessment objective 1 and requires students to apply their knowledge and understanding and also the why they are saying what they're saying and why they do things the way they do. And then assessment objective 3, questions provide the opportunity for the higher performing students to show their breadth and depth of knowledge, where they must also make evaluations and use their knowledge to make informed conclusions or judgments. Analysis and justification is required here, and we all know that different students will be able to do this to different levels. Linking back to the overall purpose of T-levels, the overall strategy requires a clear focus on application, analysis and evaluation to ensure the students are independent and work ready. So please remember to put any questions you have as we go through the webinar into the question box for us. So we're going to start off with the first point I made earlier in relation to your students' individual strengths and weaknesses. What are their hurdles? What strengths can they draw from and share? Have these been assessed? And what interventions can or have been put in place for them? All students won't be highly motivated to revise and prepare for exams, so we'll need to produce engaging activities and structure interesting tasks to motivate and engage them. How much exam and revision experience do they have? How can we assess this and plan to address any gaps in knowledge? Which brings us to the actual revision activities and how active revision activities have more success than their passive alternatives. Having fun activities to get started and then moving on to making notes on a topic, writing a summary of it, creating personal flashcards or drawing mind maps, collaborating with others, teaching someone else about a topic, drawing diagrams, writing their own scenarios, testing their friends. Don't be afraid to repeat, redo or recover topics, as repetition is also key for long-term recall. And revision for an exam could seem like a massive task, but as the philosopher suggests, it could start small and students should not let the big task overwhelm them. But where to start? Could a study buddy situation be set up to get them started? Perhaps providing an example revision routine, looking at easy wins to get them started and build their confidence. Some days they'll feel like they could conquer the world, and some days they'll need the boost of an easy win. It would probably be useful to also remind the students of this. Okay, so moving on to alleviating exam fear. So we've already established that practice of doing anything makes better. We need to make the most of the sample materials and rather than simply using them in mocks, create extension activities related to the sample questions and then maximize your use of them as the teacher. You could also use the topic tests created for the tags last academic year and contact us for more information about them if you don't have access to these. Seeing the exam from the examiner for an assessor's from an assessor's perspective can also be helpful. I know that many of you are already asking your students to create their own questions, and this could also be supported by providing scenarios with questions, but also asking the students to produce questions related to specific core elements as you finish or halfway through teaching some of the elements or the themes. And then, as I said earlier, having fun or less threatening activities can also be helpful. So consider using this approach. I'll demonstrate what I mean by this later in the webinar. For time management, this might be something that they've not thought of or done before. This could be for planning their revision activities or for the time during the exam. In the exam, if they've got 120 minutes, they need to plan best use of this time during it. Looking at the sample papers, they are generally made up of 4 multi-choice questions, 4 extended answer questions, and the remainder are short answer questions. So this can help to inform them how long they have for each question, or at least how long they have for each of the 4 sections. You might need to support the students to devise their own revision timetable. BBC Bitesize has advice and resources that can help them with this, or you may want to provide some content support or guidance to ensure that the students prioritise the topics that they need to and or the activities appropriately. Okay, the next issue relates to reading the questions properly, which can go wrong for the best of us, especially in possibly stressful exam conditions. Students should be encouraged to firstly read the instructions properly. This is something often missed or mistaken. Secondly, read all the questions carefully. Maybe you read through everything or focus on one at a time. Each has its own benefit and the students will have a preferred method. They should be reminded to check how many marks are available for each question, which I will come back to shortly. And then plan each answer in the mind and a mind map before they actually start writing on the exam paper. And then answer the question. And that sounds a bit obvious, but it's not always, and it could be explored. Check out the activities on the sample papers and get students to analyse to what extent they and their peers have answered a question effectively by doing some peer marking of some practice work. And then they could also be encouraged to name the key thinkers or experts. This means getting some theory in, as and when appropriate. Obviously not in a multiple choice question, but we would suggest this is going to be most likely to happen in the extended answer questions. And this is part of answering the question. And then moving on to students responding to questions, we're going to break this section up into the 3 different types of question. So for multiple choice, there are a number of approaches students could use. And the first one is to read the question in its entirety before looking at the answer options. So there's an example on the screen now. Does it make you think differently if the answer choices are not there? Can you try and answer it in your own mind first? So multiple choice questions can be more about eliminating the wrong answers. Read every answer option. In the example here, using our existing knowledge, we could probably discount B and C straight away. Then it's process of elimination. So the answer here is D, just for information. Just needed to consider how you've thought about that question before you saw those answers. Did you think about it in more depth? So students can use a range of sample questions to explore this process and increase students' confidence in choosing the correct answer from their own knowledge base. As I said earlier, this is something I know many centres are planning to do. So asking students to write their own multiple choice questions and answers allows them to explore their existing knowledge when providing answer choices that might be correct to get them thinking more deeply about topics. And then there's other generic advice for multiple choice questions. Could be to answer the questions they know first, and if they're not sure, then select the best answer from the options provided, or build their confidence for them to make an informed guess. So short answer questions, as I said earlier, make up the majority of the core exams. So students should remember that a short answer question requires a short answer. The marker is looking for very specific points in the answer, and it's a huge waste of time to add extra information that wasn't asked for. So students should keep their answers concise and to the point. They should focus on hitting the points they need to and give examples if and where appropriate. So the next point is also useful to keep in mind and not to ramble, and use the marks available for each question to inform what they write. 2 marks normally means 2 points they should make, 3 for 3, etc. So encourage students to apply this when they are answering this type of question. Reinforce what they should be showing in the answer. And in a short answer question, they're probably being asked to demonstrate and apply their knowledge of and understanding of something. And these are the assessment outcomes related to those points in relation to what are they showing in their answer. Are they demonstrating the knowledge and understanding? Are they applying it? Or is a short answer actually ask them to analyse and evaluate? That's more likely to be an extended answer question. So taking note of the important words and phrases in the question is important, and then they could be encouraged to rephrase the question in their answer. This should help to ensure that they stay on topic and include the relevant points. So an example of this is shown on the screen now, would be something like, the answer would simply rephrase the question starting with 2 main legislative acts which impact on such and such are. So the question, identify 2 main legislative acts. The student could start with 2 main legislative acts which impact on or such and such. So that's an example of using the short answer question to help them construct an answer. Okay, the final and most probably daunting type of question for students is the extended answer. So the first point I'd like to make here is that where students will be most likely to include analysis and evaluation and making judgments is in this type of question. These are the skills which will probably need to be supported and developed in a constructive and structured way. Students practicing this remotely or in a centre would be a good idea, while supporting them to carry out self and peer reviews of each other's work. So this sample question provides the scenario and sets the student a task to analyse the reflective cycle in relation to the context. If the student doesn't know where to start, they can practice using the question to form their answer. With this example here, they could start off by explaining how Mohammed would use the stages of the cycle as applying the theory to the scenario, which should allow the student to go on to analysing its effectiveness. Using the keywords in the question, for example, the name, details regarding the work context and course being studied, will make the answer more real and easier to write about and therefore go on to analyse. So think about how confidently your students could write in an analytical or evaluative way. They may need support to do this, and reviewing answers they've produced is one way to get started. Some detailed input on this type of higher level writing might be needed, so please have this in mind when planning teaching and learning activities. But if they're not confident to do this, please also encourage them to respond to questions using these lower level action verbs. They'll still gain some marks for doing this in the exam, so encourage them to also explain, describe, identify, etc. And we should also remember that for written answers, there are marks for the quality of the written work. So encourage careful proofreading and checking for mistakes for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Janet, is there anything I've missed out or anything else you can add here?
Again, I don't think you've missed anything out at all, Helen, and the really good descriptive accounts given. I think one thing we need to just bear in mind is that we are preparing students for probably what is likely to have been the first undertaking of a formal exam for a little while. So, you know, using all of these techniques, using all of these skills are going to be incredibly useful, if not more useful than they may have been previously. So the idea of making sure students are feeling comfortable about it, are prepared for it, know what it's going to look and feel like, the more practice you can do, the better. And I think just being familiar with what those questions can be. So using questions in context, really good way of looking at your formative assessment and seeing how well students are coping with the demands of the qualification and so on to date, but also building up that confidence in terms of, you know, exploring responses from each other, criticizing perhaps responses from each other in an open professional forum, just to try and improve skills for everyone. So yeah, I'd say these are brilliant techniques, especially in the context of where exams and assessment has been of late. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thanks a lot, Janet. So we've included some useful websites and books which you might also find useful to support your students. And as I mentioned earlier, BBC Bite Size also has some really useful support and resources for revision activities. Okay, so to create puzzles, word searches, crosswords, etc. And if you haven't used it before, puzzlemaker.com can create them for you, and it's really quick and easy. This is the website you can use for free of charge to create resources in minutes. You can copy and paste them into Word documents and then format them in any way you want. So this first example is a word search using the important terms from element 1 of the Education and Childcare T-level. This could be used as a starter activity, then the students could be asked to explain some of them in detail in relation to their preferred specialist area, but also development needs. The second is a crossword, or a crisscross puzzle, as it's called on the website. Again, terms from element 1 are used in the clues, asking the students to recall knowledge gained in teaching and learning activities. Again, extension activities could be used after completion of this, and also students could be tasked to create their own puzzles to help or revise their core knowledge. So this is what the website looks like. Please contact me if you'd like to discuss or explore this further. I can help create them in a flash, but as I say, they're very useful for starters, recap activities, consolidation, but also the basis of further teaching and learning activities. Okay, so that's the exam finished. We'll move on to the Employer Set Project, or ESP, next. And one thing our 2020 starts have told us is how much they liked the Employer Set project. The process of completing it reinforced the knowledge and understanding needed to work in the industry, and the students really understood applying that core knowledge to a real life context when completing the Employer Set project. Students who had not had much or any placement experience were still able to complete it, and they enjoyed doing so. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Janet for this slide.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. So I think what we've got to remember when we think about the Employer Set project is just to reflect for a moment on the aims and intentions of this approach. So the Employer Set project, as it says here on this slide, is very much reliant and dependent on employer input. And so what we're hoping to gain from this approach, from this type of assessment, is the application of that core knowledge into the scenarios. And the scenarios are they are constructed by us, by NCFE, but they are validated by employers. So there'll be employers who are validating the scenarios around each of those occupational specialisms as appropriate. And the idea is that students are able to apply that knowledge into a situation that is realistic, one that they can relate to. Early years students, for example, are likely to have been on placement because of the amount of hours required to complete their specialism. Also, I think assisting teaching and students doing mentoring in educational settings may also have had some experience in a workplace. So really important to be able to try and look at that. But regardless, the core, the employer set project, is the application of the knowledge into a sort of skills-based scenario where that can be applied. So it's the knowledge of the core that is being assessed, not the skills acquisition from any sort of work experience. And that is actually captured through scenarios that are developed by us and validated by employers. As well as that, you can see on the slide here, we've got core skills, and those core skills that are provided look at communicate information clearly, to engage children and young people, for example, to stimulate discussion and to secure understanding. So there are going to be elements, it's a diverse, and we're going to look at that on the next slide, but there's a diverse set of tasks within the employer set project that are actually going to test and challenge these core skills. So discussion is really important. Working with others is really important. The idea of reflecting on that is critical to this. Within the scenarios, there's going to be opportunities to explore formative and summative assessment and how that's used. And also, of course, to be able to plan and to consider all of the actions that make up part of the scenario and the questions associated with those scenarios in a safe space, in a safe way. So those core skills are running through. But what's important to remember, and of course you've got your assessment objectives there, which continue to flow through all of the assessment, including the employer set project, and you've got your weight in there, so you can see where most of this is happening, and it's around, as you would expect, the application of core knowledge to meet the development needs. So you're using that core knowledge, the students are using that core knowledge in situations where they would be able to relate that knowledge to practice that's realistic from the environment. So you'll be able to choose, students will be able to choose their scenarios, early years, assisting teaching, mentoring in educational settings, and those scenarios will test the core knowledge in context of their chosen scenario. So just some things to remember there. If students have not been on work experience for whatever reason, they will still be able to complete their employer set project because they're thinking about how that core knowledge and the skills associated with that core knowledge, how it can be applied in different situations. However, in an ideal world, placement will have been undertaken in a certain area, and that will help because that will have been enriching the experience and the learning of the core throughout. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thank you, Janet. This detailed information is really useful. So the 12-hour project is made up of 4 distinct tasks. Some of them contain multiple elements. There are 3 contextualized versions of the SP, just as Janet has said there, and the student will complete the version they are planning to complete their occupational specialism in. But don't worry if they change their mind before starting year 2 of the programme, they can do this. So this slide is going to provide a step-by-step guide to the employer set project tasks, and it starts with a student research-based activity that will be based on some pre-release project information. Student research should be focused on collating information and materials that the students have received during their learning throughout the qualification, which can include any information pertinent to the contextualized version of the assessment, for example, the early years foundation stage. The information students collate should be refined and focused on the details within the pre-release activity ahead of the supervised scheduled assessment. The pre-release material can be shared with students 3 weeks before the first supervised assessment session, which should only be scheduled to take place within the relevant assessment series window. Another important point to make here is that students must submit their research materials to their tutor before the cohort's first supervised session, and this allows it to be reviewed by the tutor and amended by the student if required. Students should not have access to the project tasks until the research materials have been approved by their tutor, and please check the tutor guidance for more information about this. So task 1A requires the students to create either an early support or early intervention plan based on the pre-release information and project brief. This is completed under supervised conditions and will be completed during the students prepared notes from their research. This will be students will not be allowed access to the internet or any additional materials during this first supervised session. There is a time limit of 3 hours for this task, and the outcome of this activity would be a word processed, either early support or intervention plan. Task 1B requires the students to produce an activity plan based on the plan they produced for task 1A. Again, this task is to be completed under supervised conditions and under the same restrictions related to the internet and additional materials as I said in task 1A. The time allowed for this task is also 3 hours, and the outcome would be a word processed activity plan. The timings for both of these tasks cannot be split up into smaller chunks. So the next task is based on student group discussion and peer review. So for 2A, students must not start this task until all the students in their cohort have completed task 1. Tutors will assign students to peer discussion groups, and each group should be made up of between 3 and 5 students. Teachers might need to consider the room or space available and cohort sizes when determining the number of students within a group. And teachers will also need to keep this manageable and ensure that the group sizes are appropriate. For task 2A part 1, the students are asked to review each other's activity plans in their peer group, produced in task 1B. They'll be preparing for this discussion by activity by completing a pro forma called preparation for peer discussion. Tutors will need to give students printed versions of the relevant task 1B activity plans for each of the students in their group, along with copies of the preparation for peer discussion pro forma. And this pro forma must be completed under supervised conditions and students must work independently. All completed forms should be handed to the tutor, who will be asked to review the completed forms to ensure that there's going to be sufficient detail to allow access to peer feedback during the actual group discussion. So verbal feedback to students can be provided if there are areas for development, but advice regarding the specific omissions or improvements shouldn't be given. Guidance here could include questions or comments such as, "You haven't said why you think that aspect of the plan worked well," or "Your question doesn't relate to how and why the others designed their plans the way they did." Or it could be, "How do you think that would improve the plan?" The students should then revise and redraft as appropriate before handing it back to the tutor for another review, but there's no time limit for that part of the task. So moving on to task 2A part 2, the students then carry out the group discussion about their activity plans. As I said, students will have hard copies of their group's activity plans and also their own completed pro forma, but it's also important to note here that they will not be allowed to make any changes to their plan during this time. This is a 20-minute supervised preparation time to allow the students to read through each other's plans and formulate their ideas and feedback for each one for the other members of their group. And during this discussion, tutors are required to ensure that every student participates and provides feedback. This might mean providing some prompts, so tutors may need to also have copies of the forms available too. Each student will have a maximum of 5 minutes to present their plan, and then each student is to provide feedback and discuss the presenter's plan. Notes related to this discussion and feedback should be taken and recorded on the pro forma by each student. And then for task 2B, the students will review the feedback they've received and make changes to improve their activity plan. And again, this must be completed under supervised conditions and within 1 hour. Moving on to task 3A, students will use their early support plan and updated activity plan to prepare for a discussion with their tutor. The students should have no more than 2 hours to prepare for this, and the beginning of the discussion should cover both plans. And at the beginning, this should cover both plans. A pro forma is provided to support the planning for this, and a tutor will also then ask questions about the plans, and this will last no longer than 10 minutes. So in 3B, the tutor should take the role of a workplace supervisor, for example, a key worker or teacher, and have a professional discussion about the approach the students took and exploring the rationale behind it. And this role play type discussion also provides the tutor to assess the students' verbal communication skills. The tutor can ask prompt questions, but they should not offer suggestions or introduce new information. This is to support the students' evaluative and reflective skills in readiness for the next and final task. Example questions tutors might use are contained in the tutor guidance documents on qualhub. And then finally, for task 4, the students will work under supervised conditions to reflect on the tasks and review their project work in relation to the project brief. And they're allowed up to 2 hours for this task. Okay, we'll have a brief look at some of the sample pre-release materials and project brief. So students should be encouraged to read and discuss the project briefs in a teaching and learning context. Explore what's there, what's not there, and where they might focus their research. So for this first example, this might include what level of progress a 37 months old child would be expected to have made, and what factors might impact negatively on a child of this age. The bullet point list at the bottom of this pre-release activity shows also what the student must consider. So it would make sense to practice using these points as factors to research in relation to this scenario, but also other scenarios. Remember that the students can have their research notes reviewed by a teacher, so this is another area they could practice and receive feedback on to develop their academic writing and reading and research skills and confidence. So then this brief would be given to the students at the start of the first supervised session. Students should practice reviewing this extra information and how their research applies to it. Teachers could also ask the students to create their own pre-release material and projects briefs using examples from their experiences. And this could be personally or from a placement if they've managed to get some industry work experience, ensuring that all personal information is obviously anonymised. Janet, is there anything I've missed about the EYE sample?
Thank you. I think there's some really good hints and tips there, Helen. I think the importance of, practicing some of these skills. So what students are basically doing in that employer set project, as you have clearly explained, students are getting their heads around a scenario. What's going on here? What sort of situation are we dealing with? What are the needs of the child or young person within this scenario? So you're thinking about that, and that's helping to form that intervention or support plan. You're then thinking about the activity. The student will be required to have formal discussions with their peers and with their tutor before they can finally revise and reflect upon it. So that cycle that you've explained to us, Helen, is something that I think students will need to think about. And as tutors, you've got this information, you know what's going to be required in terms of the skills, the confidence to contribute to a discussion, the knowing how to move a discussion forward. These are all skills and techniques that not all students will find easy or straightforward. So by encouraging those, you really are going to help all students in an inclusive way to be able to participate in the employer set project and to really be able to shine, because this is testing the core, it's going towards that sort of graded outcome, but it's also something that requires a different set of skills, I think, than the examination. So it's giving students, the opportunity really to develop the skills and techniques, just as you've said, Helen. And I think knowing what's going to happen in an employer set project, and what's going to be tested, what skills, rather than waiting for the employer set project to come along. These are things that can then be embedded within the teaching and learning of that core as formative learning. What sorts of group activities am I doing, and thinking twice about how might I put on that group activity and build up some of the confidence levels for the students in relation to the employer set project types of assessment methodologies. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thanks. That's great, Janet. We'll move next to assistant teaching. We'll do exactly the same. So this is an example from assistant teaching ESP. The same bullet points provide guidance for consideration, and students could explore the information provided again to see what's there, what's not there, and how they could use that analysis as the basis of the research. And these academic literacies and these academic skills will prove vital for them in their future studies. And then the same activities suggested on the previous slide could be used for the students to practice applying their knowledge to an ESP. Classroom learning activities could explore the type of information contained in it, how to respond to it, how to carry out research in preparation for it, and obviously practicing for the summative assessment activities. In using samples from the students themselves would be an excellent way forward, and getting them to mark each other's ESPs. I know that's activity that Wave 1 providers have been doing as well. And then exactly the same for supporting and mentoring. Everything we've suggested for the other two contextualized projects apply to this one. So build these practice activities into your teaching and learning and formative assessment activities. So all the documents the students will complete for the ESP are available on qualhub. We'd suggest students practice using these and completing them from these scenarios, from their industry placements or personal experiences, asking the students to create their own pre-release information and project briefs for each others to complete. And this will allow them to prepare for the ESP while also making clear links of theory to practice, which will help to consolidate learning and reinforce that knowledge and understanding. So this is a screenshot from qualhub, and I'll put the link to it on there as well. As you can see, the tutor guidance, the sample materials and pro formas and sample briefs are all there for you to download, adapt and use in your teaching and learning activities. So we're going to have a quick look at the actual pro formas now, and these are screenshots from that page I've just been showing you. So for early years educator and supporting and mentoring students, there's an early support plan pro forma available as a Word document for you to use. Janet, is there anything at all you want to say about this support plan?
I don't think so, Helen. I think what's on there are things, that will mean something to tutors and that are going to be part and parcel of what's been delivered in the core. And this is about bringing things together. So having this information up front is really, really useful, because what you can see there, straight away, what are students being asked to actually be able to summarize, and you've got your categories there. So it's being mindful of all of these things so that when you're doing those group activities, and by the way, I would also move your groups around a little bit, because students will gravitate to familiar groups to have discussions in, and you might want to make sure that you've got that confidence level in different various groups to enable that, should that be the case. But here you've got a really good bird's eye view, if you like, of what sorts of things are my students bringing together. What's the theory that's going to help them in this practical skills application through the scenario? And so having these sorts of documents available to you use them and use this kind of approach in your teaching and learning. Don't just wait until you're actually on top of the employer set project. This information is there and you can use it. Whilst you might not be using these templates, you can use this sort of approach in your teaching and learning.
Lovely, thanks,
Thanks, Janet.
Janet. And the same for the assistant teaching intervention plan. As Janet has quite rightly said, and we've been talking about, please use them in your teaching and learning, but also have comparisons of real life example plans from placements or from your own experience to look at the the strengths of each one and similarities as well, so they get used to the fact that they will be completing these in the industry and how they might differ as well across. Okay, there's one activity plan that is applicable to all the specialisms, and this is the form here. And we've also already mentioned some of the strategies that could be used to prepare students for this assessment activity. We'll spend some time now focused on this section. So research shows that practicing improves success. So exploring the type of activities the students will be asked to complete in the industry would be a great place to start, and practicing completing these in relation to either scenarios or real life contexts. On a more generic note, teachers could also explore project planning with students and discuss how to manage their time for this type of project. Using the correct language, terminology, and professional tone might also need to develop and/or practice, and that's the students using that kind of language in an actual plan. So looking at, analysing and evaluating completed plans would also be useful to do in groups, pairs or individually. Exploring what makes a good activity plan might be useful. And although this assessment activity is designed to assess knowledge, real examples from placements and discussion of their successes would also help the students put theory into practice. And pairing students up to share their placement experience and facilitate peer learning in preparation for this would also be useful too. As mentioned, we've already got the pro forma, so students practicing completing them will obviously be useful. You could also have some completed examples for discussion and review, with models of good and bad practice to develop the students' understanding of what will be expected of them. So group discussions are something we already do to support learning, but having specific discussions which mirror the ESP, as Janet said earlier, are also going to be useful in building students' skills and confidence for this. Have some fun with some role play here, with students acting as the tutor and vice versa for some of them. And then moving on to giving and receiving feedback. In consultations, I know centres are working on this with their students, and I would suggest also having specific feedback input related to the ESP, using the example plans, etc. already mentioned. Students may need support and guidance to help them provide feedback to each other in a professional manner. And I know how reflective practice is included in the core content and how important it is in the industry. So an extension of the learning activities being facilitated to include specifics related to the ASP are going to be useful. Students could carry out practice employer set projects and use different models of reflection to consolidate learning and develop their confidence. Which brings me to my final point on this slide. Consider how much support or guidance is going to be required for your students to be objective and evaluative. Confidence in these areas generally comes with experience, so teachers may need to plan specific activities which support the development of skills and confidence in relation to this area. Being objective, supporting students to give or take criticism professionally and properly, and phrasing feedback to each other in a positive and professional manner might be something that some or all of your students would benefit from. Practice here in a safe, supported environment might be needed. Okay, we're going to finish off by having a brief look at the Occupational Specialisms assessment. But to inform this, first of all, please let us know which specialisms you're going to be involved in. So I'm going to launch a poll in a second, asking you to tell us which occupational specialism that you're going to be involved in. If you're not sure yet, please just put not confirmed, but it'll let us know which to focus on for the remainder of today's session. So thank you to those who've already voted. We'll just leave it open a little bit longer. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we'll close that poll. So the majority of people today are early years educators. So Janet, if we focus on that one as we go through the session, please. Okay, on the screen now are the performance outcomes for each of the specialist areas, and the areas that you'll be needing to teach in the different occupational specialisms are listed and identified in depth in the qualifications spec. So I'm going to ask Janet just to say something about these performance outcomes, please.
Thank you, Helen. So as we can see here, you've got, for the first thing to notice, that the most observant among you will know that there are 5 performance outcomes in the early years pathway, occupational specialism, and there are 4 in the other 2, assisting teaching and supporting and mentoring students. And that really reflects the criticality of the early years educator criteria and the fact that there needs to be alignment with that. So there are 5 performance outcomes there. It's also important to note that when you read through those topics, so for example, concentrating on the early years, support and promote children's play development and early education, develop relationships with children to facilitate their development, plan, provide and review care, play and educational opportunities to enable children to progress, safeguard and promote the health, safety and well-being of children, and finally, work in partnership with colleagues, parents, carers and other professionals to support children's development. When you look at those, not only if you're familiar with sort of the early years framework, and so your teaching may well have been complementing this area initially anyway, but you'll also notice that there are strong overlaps with what's been going on in the core, and that's absolutely intentional. So the core is looking at 0 to 19. It's going to have that breadth. It's going to touch on all of these areas that are on the slide at the moment now. And then there's that deeper dive. So the intention now is we've looked at what's going on in education from 0 to 19. So of course it's going to touch all of these 3 occupational specialisms. We've looked at what's going on in development. We've looked at sort of that wider support network for children and young people and families and so on. And now we're doing that in more of a sort of channeled, deeper dive. And that's exactly what will happen now. So the performance outcomes, the way that you will teach in this occupational specialism side of things, is very much that deeper dive. There is an engagement with what's gone before, and there's some really good mapping documents to help you to remind students of where you've touched upon legislation, for example. If you're thinking about PO4 in the early years, for example, then you'll be able to say, do you remember when? And you might do a little refresher around that, and then you're going to contextualize. You are really going to enjoy being able to bring that coherence of theory and practice together, making real sense of it from an occupational role. That's what this sort of aspect is about. This is a very exciting element of the TQ.
Lovely, thanks, Janet. And so I'm now going to ask you just to briefly talk through each of the assessments for the specialisms.
Yes, of course. So early years educator, we can see that there now. So remember, students have done that broad core, they've done that deeper dive, they're looking at those 5 performance outcomes, which give that context. And remembering what I just said previously, we are looking now at that coherence between theory, between the knowledge and the actual skills that are being developed, embedded, established and maintained in that real work environment. So how do we test that? Well, the way that we're testing that is looking at 3 specific types of assessment. And the first one here is looking at planning. So it's planning educational activities and experience for the individual needs of a child or group of children, depending on the task that's set. So that will be very much about the importance of knowing child development, really being able to hone in on typical and therefore atypical development. The importance of recognising children's interests and needs, therefore, when you're planning experiences or providing opportunities for children to engage in experiences in an early years setting. All the richness of the students' experiences in that real work environment are going to be useful, helpful, informative, and really supportive of assignment 1. Likewise, in assignment 2, this is where we think about those early years educator criteria really significantly, because we have a part 1 and a part 2. Now, part 1 is that professional practice portfolio, that ongoing, which can start in that first year when the student starts placement in an early years setting. If they're following an early years educator occupational specialism, they'll start their placement as soon as they can. And I would probably argue personally that vocational technical qualifications should have that flavour of practice as soon as they can, regardless. But early years students, for them, it's probably even more critical because of the hours required. So we're looking for that practical competence. And assessors, so as providers, you're going to be providing the assessment process there in terms of what you're used to doing now if you're teaching early years educator qualifications, and making those decisions around the early years educator competency-based criteria. In part 2, we're looking at structured observation. So we will give you, NCFE will give you 3 situations, and we'll align the criteria that your student will need to plan for. And then again, centre, the provider assessor will go in to actually look at those structured observations. And there'll also be the opportunity for professional discussion, because we know things don't go to plan, and the student will have been able to prepare for that. And then in assignment 3, we're looking at observation and assessment of children in settings. Now, we're very much appreciative of the changes that have come about from the early years foundation stage in 2021, but we're looking now at how observation really helps in terms of being able to identify your knowledge of child development. The student needs child development more than they need anything else. They need that knowledge, and they need to therefore then appreciate the child's interests, the child's stages, and how to bring those together. So it's looking at the skills of observation in part 3. Thank you, Helen. In assisting teaching, we've got a very similar build here. So we're planning. This time we're planning activities and experiences for children in line with a teacher's session plan. So very often we're thinking of differentiation, we're thinking of resources, we're thinking of an enabling environment that's conducive to individual needs of children. So again, that richness of the teaching assistant in their placement, that's that the students can bring that into this type of assessment. You'll notice that assessment 2 is just looking at observation of skills on industry placement, and it's very similar to the way that part 2 in the early years is brought together. So 3 structured observations. And then we've got analysis in the third assessment, analysis and evaluation of case studies. So it is skills of observation, and it's also skills of the knowledge of development in terms of being able to identify when children and young people may need some extra care, some intervention and support. And then as we look at the third one there, supporting and mentoring in educational settings, again, we're looking at session planning activity. And this could be a session that's looking at something that might be based on a student's academic mentoring situation, or indeed pastoral. And there'll be some simulated mentoring sessions that the student will need to plan and prepare for and take part in, as well as the analysis and evaluation of case studies, again around making the right choices, around thinking of opportunities to support their mentees in various situations.
Lovely, thank you, Janet. We've got some questions coming in about, you mentioned starting the observations for early years educator in year 1. Would centres be advised to start any of the other assessments in year 1, or do they keep it till year 2?
Okay, so what I would say that the assessment side of things for the early years is slightly different. So you should be thinking, so providers that are in that role of assessor need to be actually engaging their students with part one of the EYE assignment two, because that's going to allow that student to build up their practical competencies over time. When it comes to the other two, when it comes to all three, in fact, then I think you can definitely be engaging in observation. You can be practicing for the structured situations that the student is going to take place in. Obviously, it's simulated for the mentors, but the assessment of the other two. So for the observation of skills on industry placement for assisting teaching, and for part two of the early years educator, again, those structured observations, the assessment of that will be in the second year, well within the occupational specialisms. And what I should say, all of these assessments, in contrast to the sort of E to A grading of the core, these are graded pass merit distinction. And Helen, you had a lovely diagram at the beginning of the presentation that showed that as well.
Lovely. And yes, and am I right in thinking that there are sample pass merit distinctions documents on qualhub as well?
Yes, absolutely. So you've got some pass and distinction papers, I believe, on the Qual Hub, and that will give you a good
Right.
sort of indication of the level that's required or expected.
Lovely, thanks, Janet. Right, a couple of questions. What qualifications do the assessors need for the occupational specialisms, please, Janet?
Okay, so if we think about this type of approach, we're thinking about provider assessors. So as in any vocational technical qualification, the assessors should be occupationally competent. So that's important. So if you've got your, if you've got experience and you've got a qualification and experience in working in the sector, this is what you need. So it's the experience. Do you need to hold an assessor qualification on top of that? Not necessarily, no, but you do need to be experienced in your role, and you do need to be experienced in that role of assessor with occupational competence from the sector you are making those decisions around.
Lovely, thank you. There's a question here which I'll probably be able to answer about resits. Are there resit opportunities? And the answer is yes. There is a summer and autumn window series for the core exams and employer set project. So we've said the summer series for this academic year is in next May and June. There's also an autumn window which takes place in November and December, and then of course you've got another summer series in the May and June of the second year, if you like. So yes, there are resit opportunities. Students are also eligible to resit up to 2 years after they finish the qualification or the course, sorry. Obviously, there are resit charges which can all be found on qualhub, but if they also can't just sit one of the exam papers. If they're going to resit, they have to resit both, and of course all the employer set project tasks. So that's the guidance there. We've also been asked, is it worthwhile doing a mock employer set project? And I would say absolutely yes, because in the tag situation this year, our Wave 1 centres were told they did not have to do the employer set project, yet all of them did it. They put the students through a mock instead to consolidate what they were doing, and also they felt that the employer set project was a bit of a celebration of that first year, and they wanted the students to do it, so sure they could apply all of that knowledge and understanding that they'd learnt. So all centres did it, found it very, very useful, and really liked it, as I said earlier on. So yes, I would absolutely do some mock employer set projects, but after you've practiced it in the teaching and learning context, if that makes sense. I'm just going to check if there are any other questions. Janet, is there anything else that we haven't said in relation to the assessment that would be useful to include?
I don't think so. I think the main thing is to remember that you've got that breadth in the core, that you're looking towards, the assessment being 2 papers, 2 exam papers, and you're doing the employer set project, and not to take for granted the skills and techniques that are required for that employer set project, to give all students the opportunity to contribute and participate in that in a way that will allow them to get the best possible outcome for them. Those skills and techniques some students find easier than others, and I think the more you do to practice that, the more you do to move students around with groups of students that they're not as familiar with, so that they actually do refine those skills. I think that's so important. Bear in mind and think about those core skills that we talked about that are embedded in the employer set project. Use as many examples as you can when it comes to preparing for the exam. I think, no matter how we dress it up, an exam is an exam, the conditions are there. However, being as prepared as you possibly can is the best way to raise confidence. And the more familiar it can feel in terms of, practice, mock papers, example questions, and so on, it's the best preparation that you can give to your students. So have a look at the examples. Don't wait until you're nearly at the end of the teaching before you think about the assessment and the preparation. Really look at it at the beginning and think about how you can embed that in your teaching and learning, because it will pay dividends for that student confidence level.
Absolutely, Janet. And I have actually seen with an Ofsted inspector a level 1 vocational teacher have their students in class when they finish a module or element writing the questions for each other, which got much praise from the Ofsted inspector. So please get your students used to writing questions and setting scenarios for each other to build that confidence. Before we finish, I've got a final poll just to ask you how you feel that how you feel now in readiness for preparing your students for the assessments. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, please let us know how you feel now after attending this webinar, please. Lovely, thank you to those who already voted. So we've got quite high levels of confidence, brilliant. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to quickly share the references from today's session. But before we go, I'm just going to ask Janet if there's anything else you'd like to share, pearls of wisdom, before we say goodbye to anybody.
I think just to say, just remember that these are, level 3 students. Remember that there is a wide range of assessment objectives. Helen was talking about assessment objective 1, about the recall, about the how, and then building up to that analysis and evaluation. So the way that the questions have been designed, the way that the assessments have been designed, will allow student input, participation, and success and achievement on a scale. This is not a qualification that is for a certain set of people. This is a qualification that's for everyone who has got that criteria for level 3. So remember that, and make sure you prepare your students the best, and I know you will, in the best possible way that you can. And enjoy it, because I know when you're delivering a new qualification, I can only put myself into that position, and I'd be a little bit anxious. I'd want to make sure I was getting everything right, ticking all the boxes, looking at the specification, and thinking how I could best deliver that. Be mindful of the resources that are available, but most of all, remember this is your subject area. Enjoy it, share that with the students, and you won't go far wrong.
Lovely, thanks, Janet. So we do have an evaluation form which will be available automatically as you log out of today's session. So we do ask you to please take a minute to complete it for us, because we do use the feedback to adapt our sessions and approach, and just to make sure that we are meeting our provider needs. So many thanks for your attendance and input today's session. Until next time, please stay safe and well. Thank you so much, everybody.